reflecting on your tenure at the UNSC, both in representing the UAE and providing a voice for the Arab world, how satisfied are you with what was achieved?
Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Sigrid, also for agreeing to do this panel. And I'd like to thank Becky in particular for her support throughout the Council term in highlighting the importance of the Security Council to international peace and security at what, as she has described, was a really critical time of global fracture in terms of big power relations. So I'd say that's the framing indeed of our Security Council term. As she rightly pointed out, there was the Russia-Ukraine war in February, but on January 17th, as many of you who are residing here know, the UAE was also the subject to attacks by Houthi drone missiles, and so we were dealing with that in the very first days of our Security Council membership, and were able to help steer a resolution that designated the Houthis and their acts against the UAE as terrorist in nature. And so from that point on, I'd say the big lesson in geopolitics and diplomacy is no matter how much preparation you do, and indeed our foreign minister has been preparing us since appointing me in September 2013 to New York for this council term, and let's not forget that we only come on the council once every 40 or 50 years as a revolving member in the Arab group. No matter how much you prepare, Harold Wilson, events, dear boy, events take over, and you have to be an agile diplomatic service in order to be able to respond to these fast-moving events as they happen. So that's, I think, the first lesson for UAE diplomats. And although Becky very kindly commended the mission team in New York, I'm looking at a number of colleagues here from the Foreign Ministry that completed that team in various missions around the world, and this would have been an impossible 2 years without that support, without the information flow from different capitals, and without the full support of headquarters during this difficult time. To answer your question, were we satisfied? That's a very difficult question to answer. If you look over the 2-year period, there were more vetoes in the last 2 years than there had been in any point in the Council's history, so 9 vetoes over a 2-year period. The numbers of resolutions adopted by consensus had also declined considerably by about 30%. So we really were, because of the events, dealing with a very fractured time in diplomatic relations, and as a result, I think the UAE stepped into a role which many of you here know well, which is that role of bridge building, creative entrepreneurial diplomacy, trying to find a pathway forward when the big powers seem entrenched in zero-sum positions. I think overall, when I finished the council term with the team, we were sitting and reflecting on that particularly difficult last week where the resolution 2720 was adopted despite numerous delays to the vote and quite a build-up to its adoption due to the negotiations. And I was asked, how did I feel about that particular week, the Gaza conflict in particular, which had taken up perhaps some of the most enormous energy and creative thinking as a mission that we had been able to produce in the 2 years. And I said I was satisfied that we had not left a stone unturned, that we had not wasted a minute or a day or a night, and there were many sleepless nights, in trying to achieve what the Charter calls for, peace and security, preventing the scourge of war. I was satisfied that we had tried everything in our toolkit as diplomats to push the levers of international diplomacy at a time where it was incredibly difficult. So I'll answer the question on satisfaction with that. I was satisfied that we had tried our best. It felt like we had fallen short, given the scale of human suffering in Gaza, but also in various conflicts around the world. But it has fallen short because of these fractures in the international order. And maybe at some point during this conversation, we can reflect a little bit about that. I still do believe this is the most important international order that we have and that we must protect, because it is the basis of our world system as we know it today, and I think it will help us preserve peace going forward.
Good, thank you. And we will absolutely get to the kind of wider story of navigating the system, the international diplomatic arena, you know, reflecting and getting the reflections of both of you as to whether this is, you know, really, let's be quite frank, fit for purpose, and if not, what's the fix? Let's drill down, because the work that you achieved tirelessly, and I know when I say tirelessly, I was sending messages to Lana, expecting her not to respond because it was 3 o'clock in the morning, New York time, on a regular basis, and I was getting regular messages back trying to sort of stand up what was going on the floor. And I think just, again, I'll say, you know, those 2 years, reputationally, I think have been extraordinary. And I think it's shown as the UAE has evolved its own sort of foreign policy and its sort of strategic priorities and visions. So that was very much reflected by the leadership that you showed for the 22-member Arab group. Sigrid, your new role as, let's call it, Chief Aid Coordinator in Gaza comes very specifically off 2720. As we speak today, most of the international community, including the UAE, is warning Israel about carrying out a large-scale military offensive in Rafah. Over the past 24 hours, we've seen airstrikes, at least, leading to the death of 100 Palestinians, the rescue of 2 Israeli hostages in special operations. You were recently on the ground, albeit before this latest Rafah offensive. What is your assessment in terms of needs and action on the ground, and what would a large-scale military operation in Rafah mean in terms of civilians displaced? And I want you to be quite clear about the risks that you feel we face.
No, thanks very much. I've been to Rafah on two visits, day visits. I had intended to spend the night, but it wasn't possible the last occasion. What you see, and I wouldn't qualify it as an assessment, that requires a lot more. What you see is desperate people grouped together, makeshift tents everywhere, blocking streets because people are just queuing where there is safety or where there are limited form of services, maybe availability of water one day, the next there is none. There is tremendous, I think, despair. At the same time, we know from the statistics of my UN colleagues, OCHA and others, that there is tremendous food insecurity, obviously lack of drinking water, lack of basic services. The goods are not coming in the volume that is required to meet minimum basic human requirements. I mean, it's all out there. What you see as well, which is very concerning, I think, is garbage not being collected. So the risk of infectious diseases being on the rise, new viruses apparently also coming out, it's all accumulation of a festering, deep crisis in an overpopulated Gaza Strip, which is overpopulated by definition, and now people desperately weak and vulnerable being co-located, and location is not the right word in this case. Now, what would this mean if, under the threat of military action, very much tied, of course, to Israel's desire to free the hostages, and that is something we as an international community as such, of course, always call for. Resolution 2720 also does that. That is, of course, a sine qua non, I would say. However, the threat of military action on an already very weak, vulnerable population that has nowhere to go poses huge risks. And that's why I think President Biden, but prior, of course, the Secretary General, many other world leaders have expressed, I would say, euphemistically perhaps, tremendous caution. What does it mean in terms of our ability to reach people? I think that's the big unknown. The risks already for humanitarian workers are significant. They are very high. I can't compare it at the moment one-on-one to other crisis situations, but there's a stretch to what we can ask of humanitarian workers, under which conditions they could still safely reach people. And of course, there is the elephant in the room, the sort of the blockage on UNRWA's humanitarian ability to deliver, given Israel's allegations and the need, of course, for a very proper investigation which is ongoing. But if UNRWA cannot deliver, there are airstrikes, there is an increase of attacks. Civilian population, I think, risks being the ultimate casualty. And this, of course, is of concern to all of us when we speak of international humanitarian law, when we speak of issues of access. This is not an easy one. Now, I know Israeli authorities are informing or stating that they will find and plan for ways, but ultimately all resolutions call for access, for protection, for safety, alongside, of course, the unconditional release of the hostages. A temporary ceasefire, a humanitarian pause, is so much needed.
And that is what 2720 that you worked so hard on before Christmas calls for. You said at the time, look, this isn't perfect. You said that on the floor of the UNSC, but it was what you could get at the time. We are, 6 weeks on from getting that resolution through, and we are faced with, the prospect of mass displacement in Rafah, the prospect of a, closed and possibly more permanently closed Rafah border crossing. The Egyptians obviously have clear concerns, security concerns themselves. How worried are you at this point? And do you echo, Sigrid's concerns?
Yeah, look, the UAE is extremely worried at this point, and that's why we issued a clear statement a couple of days ago warning that any military operation in Rafah would have unacceptable consequences for the 1.4 million people who have already been displaced once, who are all crammed into this tiny space in Rafah at the border crossing. Previously, around 300,000 people had resided there, so that's a 5 times fold increase of the population center in Rafah. And I think that shows you how serious and consequential any military operation would be there. And I think that is why the international community, all countries that have been following this file have stated that any military operation in Rafah would have severe consequences. You would not be able to protect the civilian population there, which is indeed what 2720's called for, what 2712 has also called for, what the UAE's humanitarian ceasefire resolution that we took to the Security Council, which was vetoed, called for, and it was then adopted in the General Assembly by 153 countries. This is the international consensus that Sigrid has just referred to. What we need today is a humanitarian ceasefire. That has been our position consistently. It is also why the UAE took a number of Security Council ambassadors, including incoming ambassadors, to the Rafah border crossing 10 days before the adoption of 2720 to see with their own eyes the trucks lining up the border, hundreds of trucks of aid not going in, vital aid for so many people desperately in need, and also to see in the hospitals in Al Arish the devastation of those who have been wounded permanently by this conflict, including children. So you have 27,000 now who have been killed. You have several tens of thousands who have been wounded. 17,000 children, according to UNICEF, don't have any parents. 17,000 children today do not have any surviving parents. So if you think about the untold consequences of this conflict for decades to come, not only in the Palestinian territories, not only for the Israelis, but in our entire region, we are talking about a conflict that has regional scale, but also has international scale and consequences. And that is why it's not only the Council resolutions, but also the ICJ provisional measures that were adopted, 6 of which called on the Israeli government to make sure it was not committing acts of atrocity on the civilian population are so important. And I think that, whilst recognizing what Sigrid has said, and this is indeed included in Resolution 2720, the hostages must come out. And that has been an unequivocal position of the United Arab Emirates, that these hostages must be released, but they cannot be released in this state of conflict. When I've met with hostage families, honestly, my heart goes out to them, the extraordinary trauma and pain that they are also feeling with their loved ones captured in the Gaza Strip. Having said that, the scale of the response, the scale of the devastation in Gaza, with 70% of it uninhabitable today, and these are people that have been many times displaced, I think shows that we need to, as Sigrid has said, stop. We need a pause. We need that to lead to a more permanent ceasefire. We need the hostages out. We need the scale up of aid going in. Now, what Becky's pointing to is that the resolutions are not working in the way that they were intended to work, and that is always the case with diplomatic toolkits. You have to create consensus, you have to create pressure, and you have to create push for those things to happen. But we, as the UAE, are fully committed to that. That's why we have a field hospital operating in Gaza. That's why we've just sent a maritime ship hospital with 100-bed capacity that's now currently docked in Al Arish port. That's why we've got 6 desalination plants online already on the border of Gaza, and we're putting another 2 desalination plants online. That is going to provide desalinated water to over 1 million residents of Gaza. We're doing our part, but everyone else has to also do their part. We need this international coalition that helps stabilize the situation, that helps bring about a longer-term solution, which you were asking for, Becky, at the outset. And I think as diplomats, it's our job to always remain focused on that, to remain optimistic, to keep trying on the corners of what is possible, to push the envelope, to get to that long-term solution, which is an Israeli and Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security and fully integrated into our broader region as well. That is what we are working for as the UAE.
And I want to talk about that and the reconstruction efforts as part of your remit going forward. I know that you've been in Cyprus recently. You've been talking about opening up maritime corridors. But this is, this is ultimately with a view, as you are making very clear here, with a view that everybody understands that there is a need for a humanitarian pause or ceasefire. Language differs depending on who you speak to. I think there's two things that we should briefly discuss here. All eyes will be on Cairo tomorrow, ostensibly further talks on hostage negotiations and truce talks. I wonder how hopeful you are that a multi-phase deal, as is being proposed, can halt the fighting and pave the way for some sort of political solution. That is going to depend on whether Hamas and Israel can get onto the same page, and there is no evidence at this point, unless you've seen some evidence that that is the case. I also wonder just how important it is at this point, Lana, that we talk about the work that physically needs to be done on the ground to get, nobody can wait. Those in Rafah cannot wait for humanitarian assistance. So what are you doing as far as talking to the international community? What do you understand to be the kind of the conversations going on at this point to try and affect more access, not less? Because as we face the potential of a full-on onslaught in Rafah, there is going to be less access, not more. Sigrid.
It's a tough one, and yet it's a concrete one, because the resolution, if I go back to 2720, spoke distinctly on the need to facilitate, accelerate, and expedite humanitarian aid getting to all those in need in Gaza. Now, that is actually the entire population in Gaza, that's from south to north, to create access. And that means basically I've been meeting and talking to all of the concerned parties, Israeli authorities, Egyptians, Jordanians, but also Cyprus, to see how we can get goods in volume, quality, and sustainably to the population. And that means land, air, and by sea, potentially. But that, of course, still depends on either a humanitarian ceasefire or humanitarian pauses to actually be able to scale up and to know which entry points you can use and if they are safe, if actually the humanitarian workers can deliver the aid in what we call in a deconflicted manner, i.e. they won't be shot at or they won't be in a crossfire. All these things are clearly not yet in place. I would say there is
Who's holding them up? Is Israel holding them up at this point?
It's not a black or white. There is a conflict going on, and that's always the difficulty. Humanitarian aid delivery in a sustained manner in situations of active fighting are not impossible, but they're high risk, very dangerous to the workers and to the civilians. Now, then you come back to the resolution, asking for a humanitarian ceasefire of humanitarian pauses. This is needed if you want to sustain the assistance to the people, and they desperately need it. I think all our hearts break if we read that sort of chicken feed is now grain to be used as a sort of substitute for wheat for the population in the north. It's political. I negotiate behind the scenes, so to speak, speak to the Egyptians on what they could do more, what the Jordanians are willing to do more, and of course, which access routes we can use.
What does that more look like?
More can be volume, can be using the very trusted Israeli-Jordanian channels to see if the regional supply function from Jordan could be used, so we can actually get the goods into Gaza. From El Arish, phenomenal work is happening under the leadership of the Egyptian Red Crescent Society, yet we think there's potential that could be exploited. We're leaving no stone unturned, but ultimately we need to be able to reach people, and our humanitarian workers also need to be able to be in a place not to be shot at, but actually be alongside people. Protection has many different faces and forms.
International peace and security is wholly sort of, predicated on the fact that people will mediate, people will get involved. The international community is willing to get involved. You met with Secretary Blinken last week. Lana, I know that the UAE is speaking to the Americans. It's becoming increasingly clear that Washington's influence in getting Israel to agree to a halt in the fighting is limited, at least to date. From your discussion, Sigrid, what more should or can America be doing at this point?
Ask me no questions, I'll tell you no lies. But I think I'm not quite sure if it's helpful that I play the role here of a side commentator. As I said, I use the quiet diplomacy. You won't see me on Twitter. You won't see me issue statements, because my role is to enable others and our team to get the job done. The more I say publicly, the more it detracts actually from the goal, which is volume, quality of aid in a sustained manner to the people in Gaza. I think the Americans play their role. They're a big player, but I would say, like to also turn again to a role that the UAE plays. You don't always have to be the biggest player on the block. You need the very refined diplomacy of a country such as the UAE, which a country such as the Israeli government, but also Jordanians and Egypt, all have good relations. So the relative impact and the maximal opportunity the UAE has and plays is equally important. It's about different coalitions, I would say, the larger countries and the other countries. I come from a small country, and when the larger European countries called us a small country, then we sort of say, well, we're different, but we're the 17th economy. So, Lana,
yeah, go on.
Well, I can answer that question directly. We would have liked the United States not to have vetoed our ceasefire resolution in December. We thought that represented the will of the majority of countries around the world, that it was the right thing to do in that moment. We called in that resolution also for the release unconditionally of the hostages, and we thought it was exactly the moment to call for a humanitarian ceasefire. So we'd have liked for that. Having said that, we work very constructively and closely with the United States, who have also been incredibly committed on the humanitarian aid situation in Gaza, to work through some of these diplomatic challenges to create the position of the humanitarian coordinator and to have someone of Sigrid's caliber and stature be the front file holder on humanitarian aid into Gaza. But 2720 also, with US support, called for the realization of the two-state solution in accordance with international law, recognizing the Palestinians' right to self-determination, hugely important. It called for the scale-up of aid by land, sea, and air, which means that it is now an obligation by council resolution on Israel to open up all its border crossings for that aid to be scaled up in pace and volume. So Karam Abu Salem, but also other crossings. And the UAE has been part of a coalition of countries, but we ourselves have taken almost 200 air shipments of aid into Gaza by air. We're also doing what we can by sea and by land. So there are things that we can do. We're not the frontline player, but I think we're an important voice in the discussion. I recently accompanied our foreign minister to a meeting of some of our regional partners in Riyadh, and I think Saudi Arabia's initiatives on this file and their leadership have also been very clear and unequivocal, and we fully support that, as have Qatar's on the hostage negotiations, Egypt on the hostage negotiations. So we're all trying to play our part with the equities and the relationships that we have to help what is a dire situation. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me ask then. You've said that without a roadmap to a US-backed two-state solution, quote, we're not going to be as fully invested in the rebuild, in the reconstruction of Gaza, and with Israel, that will also have an effect. That's not the trajectory you say that we signed the Abraham Accords on. You talk about the two-state solution, that being the Palestinian horizon. Israel's prime minister has repeatedly rejected a two-state solution. Quote, I will not compromise on full Israel security control over the entire area in the west of Jordan, and this is contrary to a Palestinian state. With that kind of comment, where do you stand? Do you see an Arab consensus? You talk about being in Riyadh recently. Is there an Arab consensus emerging on this issue around what a pathway would look like, tangible, stuff we can get our arms around? What does that actually look like? And there will be people out there who say, can you still explain why the Abraham Accords make sense?
So a lot of questions there to unpack. I'll go back to, you started by talking about our tolerance resolution, 2686. I think That resolution is more relevant today than at any time because it basically says that extremism, lack of tolerance, zero-sum approaches to ideology and coexistence will always lead to the breakdown of peace and security. We're seeing that here on the ground, and it applies to all the extremists in our region, from whatever political spectrum they come from. You cannot deny the Palestinian right to statehood, and that is an Arab consensus. It's enshrined in the Arab Peace Initiative, and it's been reiterated at several meetings since then. The quote you refer to indeed is the UAE position that we are a partner to the Palestinians like other Arab countries in the region. We've committed billions of dollars to development in Palestine since the Oslo Accords. But we cannot keep refunding and then seeing everything that we have built destroyed in yet another conflict, in yet another breakout of violence. So what we are essentially saying in an Arab consensus is that there must be an irreversible progression to the two-state solution for regional partners to be on board with the reconstruction part of Sigrid's mandate. And that has to be something that has international guardrails and benchmarks, and it has to have the support of the United States amongst other key actors. It is also undoubtable that the US has a key role to play as a regional player in this file and in other files, and has done so for decades. But I think what we've been seeing over the course of the last decade is a move from countries like the UAE to burden share some of those security responsibilities. So I think you see the UAE that is active in many different theaters in order to guarantee peace and security to a wider array of theaters. And I think you'll continue to see that within our confines, of course, but we will continue to play our part for peace and security. So yes, the US must be a key partner, and we're talking to them very closely, and we're working with them very closely on that. And I think there are a number of initiatives that we are in close consultation with them on, and that are proving constructive. But let's not also forget that this year we're going to see 60% of the planet go through elections. So it is also not a particularly stable year in international relations. And then in terms of the regional consensus, I do think you see a very strong regional consensus that we cannot continue managing this conflict. We have to resolve it. And resolving this conflict is indeed the two-state solution.
Is it any clearer what that pathway looks like at this point?
I think the pathway is a humanitarian ceasefire. It's the hostages out, it's aid in, it's treating the wounded, the tens of thousands of people who are wounded, the 17,000 children who do not have parents, need to be found relatives and homes and psychosocial support. That is priority number one. And then we need to see a series of confidence-building measures, including with the Israelis, including with regional partners, that we want to see Israel's full integration in our region as part of the two-state solution parameters for the Palestinian people, that they must be allowed to govern themselves and their future in two states that provide security and stability for both peoples. That's the vision.
Can I just come back to funding? Because, without UNRWA funding, many experts are saying that's going to run out. The revenues will run out by the end of this month. I wonder, from your perspective, what that means. The UAE pledged $5 million to support your own work recently. This is not UNRWA funding. This is very specifically your work. So, two questions here. I know that there's an independent investigation that's now been announced by the Secretary General. That's important, as well as the UN investigation into the allegations against UNRWA staff on October the 7th. But just how risky is this suspension in funding for the agency? And then, to the point of the UAE's funding of your own very specific work, how will that money be spent, and what more do you need at this point?
How risky is it? I mean, I think the UN and the Secretary General, UNRWA, have reacted earlier. Yeah, this is a high risk. Now, we understand, also my own country and others, that they felt the need to suspend pending a proper investigation. However, these decisions they don't come cheaply. I.e., if you cut funding or reduce funding or you hold in suspense the support to the lifeline of the majority or now almost all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, while an active conflict is raging, and the only actor that can provide bulk, delivery, and has the trust of the local population, you're running a very high risk. And this is not the time to say substitution. It is not a change of a shop. I go to A, no, I don't like that one anymore, I go to B. It's not as simple as that. Now is not the time. Should there be another political discussion, that is for other moments and is very much tied to the two-state solution. It also depends in future which authority would be allowed to come back and actually provide for civil services. Those are all discussions that are part of the political process, and you cannot sort of change teams whilst in the middle of a war. But at the same time, the UN Secretary General takes the allegations very seriously, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs Catherine Colonna is undertaking a so-called neutrality review. As part of due process, it is always proper from the position of the UN to await the findings and then have a rightful discussion. Now, I don't know what a number of the donor countries will do, what they will decide. Today, there's a European Council meeting of Ministers of Development Cooperation. Philippe Lazzarini is engaging with them. We need to keep going on, but substitution is not something you organize overnight.
And just to be clear about this, as I understand it, the public results of that investigation aren't due until something like April or the end of April.
There are two, the investigation end of February, I believe, or early March, and then the neutrality review, April, but with an interim report. And yes, I understand as well, I mean, I've just left government and parliaments are asking questions and elections are happening in many countries. So there's a lot of pressure also on the politicians. But here it's also wise to wait for the full outcome of the investigations, noting that the allegations are deeply troubling and very worrisome and ought to be taken with the utmost serious. That is part of the job. That is also part of being a responsible international organization. Now, coming then to the delivery of humanitarian aid, my team is small, lean and mean. I'm supposed to leverage, and I'm trying definitely to yield the power of the system, because I'm coordinating all the assets with my colleagues on the ground, the UN country team, as it's called, for the sort of the real amateurs or the lovers of the UN system. But this is about the international community. This is about choice, this is about direction, and this is providing assets, finance, and people to get the job done. That requires coordination, because we're all kings and queens at duplication, or we love to choose the same sector. This will undoubtedly happen over time. Every sector has some donor darlings, but we need to make choice, and I think my role is to lift it to the political level. What we intend to do once my office is established, there'll be monitoring and verification from Gaza, which can do two things. First, that we ensure the aid reaches those people that truly need it, that the system functions, but it also provides for a greater political accountability for those countries or organizations that are worried that aid actually falls into the wrong hands. But as you can imagine, right now, I intend to open an office in Gaza, but not today and perhaps not next week. But the direction of travel is to work from Gaza, because politically I feel, as the senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator, I have to be on the ground where it needs to happen.
You were in Jerusalem just before you got here. I mean, what sort of feedback are you getting from the Prime Minister, the military, the government there about, whether or not they will support you in your efforts?
Well, I've met all representatives a number of times now of the War Cabinet. I have not yet spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I have spoken to Prime Minister Shtayyeh, but we'll stick to Jerusalem. Then maybe a point on Ramallah. I would say the discussions are forward-leaning. As you know, there is a lot of criticism voiced at the totality of the UN. There is deep suspicion, criticism, wariness, reinforced by the allegations surrounding UNRWA. I can't deny that. At the same time, there's a resolution. And in our conversations, both sides are very clear that we need to deliver. And the contribution, support for Israel at the political level and operational level to ensure that we can collectively do our work to reach people in Gaza is of the primordial importance. And I report back to the Council. This is very different from all other humanitarian operations. A Security Council resolution gives political weight, gives wings, and also has a tasking and an accountability. Now, when it comes to the PA, I just wanted to make that bridge also to the political process again. The Palestinian Authority is planning, on its reform, or its revitalization or the reset, whichever one of the R nomina you choose. But a return to Gaza is obviously in their mindset. So there seem to be sometimes in the conversations parallel tracks, because obviously politically the Israelis are not necessarily speaking of a PA from Gaza, and reconstruction without the political track is not going to attract donor financing, not from the EU, not from the Gulf states, not from the traditional supporters of investments when it comes to the Palestinian territories. And I think that is politically a fair conclusion.
Lana, we've got 5 or 6 minutes left, and we started by discussing the UAE's 2-year tenure as a non-permanent member of the UNSC and the biggest challenges you faced navigating the UN and by extension international sort of diplomatic arena, and the resolutions on Gaza and humanitarian aid very much speak to that, and we've used that as an example of the challenges that you've faced. It was in 27-20, this was specifically designed to accelerate the access for and delivery of aid into Gaza. Again, you've said it wasn't perfect, you admit that. Critics say in stopping short of calling for a ceasefire, it was rendered much less effective, but it did end up carving out a small amount of space between both the US and Russia. I know the wording was changed, but ultimately to get an abstention from the US, which allowed this to go through, and indeed from Russia, this was something that both parties could live with, and therefore the international community could get on with. Such is the complexity of global diplomacy. It's not perfect. Some will argue it's a broken system. It's not fit for purpose. What's your perspective? I mean, I hear Sheikh Abdullah here talk about the importance of accelerating multilateral activity, of ensuring that there is sort of multilateral thought and intervention. What's your perspective here? Is this a system that you have been so embedded in now for the last sort of, more than a decade, but very specifically over the last couple of years? If it is broken, what's the fix at this point?
We have a phrase in the foreign ministry, going native, that the foreign minister will always pull you out of a post if he thinks you've become too sympathetic, too empathetic to the place that you are representing your country in. And I would say that I have certainly felt that empathy towards the multilateral system in my decade there. And that's because it's not perfect, it's a little bit broken, and particularly over the last 2 years, but it's the best chance we have for a place, a table where all countries around the world, and we saw this in the incredible achievements of COP28 as well, where countries can come around and negotiate what are difficult, thorny, seemingly intractable issues and come out with outcomes that aim to preserve stability, development, prosperity for humanity. As I said, we saw in COP28. I think we saw it to a degree with what we tried to do humbly as the UAE in our Security Council term. So although there was this geopolitical fracture, we were able to see 4 resolutions adopted on Afghanistan, another thorny file with a lot of different countries with different equities and interests in that file. And the most important one was the one you referenced, the one that condemned the Taliban's edict stopping UN women workers from working in UN offices and across the country, and stopping them from education, which we believe is a fundamental right. And I think the UAE's approach is best described as one of principled pragmatism. So we are principled about the basis of our international order, about the international legal system that underpins it, which prevents the sort of law of the jungle, being the law of nation states' interactions with each other. So might is right is not a world order any of us want to live in. And that's why I think our commitment to international law is so, as a medium-sized country, so solid and based on such foundation. But at the same time, we're pragmatic. We're pragmatic about the different equities from different countries, their different stakes involved in the international system. We will say always what we think is the right course of action, as we did with the humanitarian ceasefire several times in the Security Council. But when we found that that would have been vetoed, we moved forward to try and help people on the ground in a practical way. I think that it is a little bit easier to take political platforms. It makes you feel momentarily satisfied that you take a very, very high-level principled position. You don't accept any negotiation around it. But in fact, you're not helping people on the ground. And I think the perspective of our foreign minister, who you've referenced, and of the leadership of our president has been, how do we help the people on the ground in this enormously difficult situation?
And leaving the door open to Israel by continuing to back the Abraham Accords, which is something that they were signed as a sort of strategic sort of policy, state to state, a couple of years ago. That is about bridge building, is it? That is about keeping a door open to opportunity. How do you explain that?
So our tolerance resolution says that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Christianophobia, extremism are the underpinnings of conflict and war. And we believe that in every fiber of our foreign policy, and we act on that belief. That's one of the reasons I was proud every day to walk into the Security Council chamber, because the foreign policy principles that I espoused were the foreign policy actions of my country. And I think we can all, and I look at my colleagues again from the Foreign Ministry in this room, we can all hold our heads up high when that is the spirit and the practice of your country's foreign policy actions, both regionally but internationally. I think with Israel, today we have almost 1,000 children and cancer patients in the UAE who are getting some desperately needed medical care because of that cooperation. As I said at the beginning, we have a field hospital in Gaza. We have a maritime hospital docking in the Al Arish port today or yesterday, and we have 7 desalination plants now online for 1 million residents of Gaza. It's not enough. What we need, and what we've said and will continue to say, is a humanitarian ceasefire and a two-state solution. Will we get that by talking to the people who agree with us? No. We will get that by talking to the people who disagree with us. And the UAE will always be proud of doing that.
And with something like 38 seconds to go, just your final thoughts, if you will. You've got 30 years' experience of working the UN system. Lana's just described, how difficult this can be, how challenging this can be, how important the UAE feels it is that there is a multilateral system that is there, and if it can be, made better, fixed, or then what does that fix look like?
I'm not sure what the fix looks like, but there are two things. The member states are shareholders, and they have to own it. And I was a minister for aid, and I was a minister for finance. And I see a big difference in how the Bretton Woods institutions are treated, political support, large financing flows, and the UN system. And you need to be equal, and you need to be consistent, and you need to be coherent. So there's a member state call. I don't think it's the system. Yes, the system itself can do better, can be less bureaucratic, more agile, work better together, deliver on the UN reform. But ultimately, the member states have the decision-making authority. You want a Security Council to be effective? Have the political will, both for reform, but also for implementation, or adherence or compliance with resolutions. The UN development or humanitarian system, equally so. A lot of operations are run on a shoestring, and yet member states have a sort of a big ask. And, I know it very well because I've just left 6 years of asking questions to whatever international organization. And I sometimes felt very bad. I thought asking questions, criticizing is the easiest bit. To be part of the journey to deliver and ensure that your shareholdership in a development system or the political system reaches the yields that you ask requires indeed compromise. It requires a new equilibrium. It requires also a recognition for some that the Global South has fully arrived and wants to have its voice heard, its influence seen and felt, and that the world today is very, very different. Now, in crisis moments, you can always go plurilateral. We've seen that in the days of Trump at the WTO. We couldn't do anything multilateral. Then you get a coalition of the so-called willing, and you say, you know what, on this topic, those who want to work multilaterally will do it plurilaterally. There are always different options to achieve. But I was shocked when I came back to the Netherlands to see how little in Europe the UN still mattered. It doesn't appear in media anymore. It's not a frame of reference the way it was when I was young. Now, yes, I'm much older, But the UN, in many other countries, is still a reference frame. So if you want unity and build, again, universality around principles as well as solutions, we need to sort of drive that agenda. Potentially the Summit of the Future next year that the SG will host would be such a moment, but then we need to be there at the right level, walk the talk, and invest in a system to be truly fit for purpose, and that's not a shoestring operation.
With that, I'm going to leave it there. We wish you the best. I know that there is a huge need for support for the work that you will be doing in the days ahead. We've talked about the very pressing concerns, threats, and worries about Rafah at present, and it's it's been a pleasure to catch up after what have been these 2 years of, as I say, tireless work as part of the UNSC. We look forward to seeing what you're going to do next, and whether anybody can kind of match the momentum that you've needed to keep going. But Lana, thank you, and Sigrid, for your time today. Thank you very much indeed.